There's a photograph sitting in a digital archive that, at first glance, tells a perfectly ordinary story. A family, a living room, Sunday clothes pressed and clean. But look closer, just slightly to the left, resting quietly in a wooden chair at the edge of the frame, and you'll find something that historians could not explain. A small handmade figure, a boy, dressed in a tiny white shirt and dark trousers, seated upright as if he belonged there. And his hair is unlike anything you would expect to find on a handmade doll. What secret is this family keeping? What story did they carry into that room on the day someone pressed the shutter? The answer will take over a century to surface, and when it does, it will change the way we understand what it meant to love someone you were never allowed to grieve out loud. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Every week, we find the hidden histories that photographs have been keeping for decades. Now, let's go back to 1910. It was a Tuesday morning in October 2021 when James Whitfield first opened the file. He was a historian and archivist at a university in Nashville, Tennessee, 43 years old, with 17 years of experience cataloging photographs from the American South. He had seen thousands of images from the early 20th century. Stoic faces, formal poses, the particular stillness that people assumed when they knew they were being recorded for history. He was not a man easily moved by photographs. That morning, however, something made him pause. The image had been donated to the university's digital archive by a small county historical society in rural Georgia. It arrived with almost no metadata, just a rough date estimate, 1910, and a single handwritten note on the back of the original print that read, "For those who come after us." No names, no location, no explanation. James almost moved past it. The photograph showed a black family of 5 posed in their living room. A man and a woman seated at the center, 3 children arranged around them, the youngest standing close to her mother's knee. They were dressed with extraordinary care. The man wore a dark suit with a white collar. The woman's dress was high-necked and immaculate. The children looked scrubbed and serious, the way children do when adults have told them more than once not to move. The room itself was modest but deliberate. A patterned rug covered the floor. A framed picture hung on the wall behind them, slightly crooked. A small side table held a ceramic lamp. Everything in the frame spoke of a family that had built something, not just a house, but a life with intention and pride. James studied their faces. The man's jaw was set, dignified. The woman's eyes looked directly into the camera with an expression James could not quite name, not sadness, not pride, but something in between, something older than both. He was about to log the photograph and move on when his eyes drifted to the left edge of the frame. There, in a small wooden chair pushed against the wall, sat a figure, small, handmade, dressed in dark trousers and a white shirt. He almost didn't register it. Then he looked again. Something about it was different. He couldn't say exactly what, not yet. But his hand moved to the zoom function before his mind had fully formed the question. James enlarged the image. The resolution was remarkable for a photograph of that era, sharp enough that the texture of the rug was visible, that the grain of the wooden chair could be made out clearly. As the small figure filled his screen, he leaned forward and felt something shift quietly in his chest. The figure was a handmade boy doll. That much was obvious. The body was sewn from plain cotton fabric, stuffed and stitched by someone who knew how to work with their hands but was not a professional seamstress. It wore a miniature white shirt with a small collar, dark trousers carefully hemmed, and tiny suspenders, the kind of Sunday clothes a young boy of that era would have worn to church. Someone had spent real time constructing this. Someone had cared deeply about the details. But it was the hair that stopped him. Most handmade figures of that period used yarn, thread, or scraps of dark fabric to suggest hair. It was practical, inexpensive, and sufficient. The boy doll in the photograph had none of those things. His hair was dark, dense, and fine, coiled in small, tight curls that caught the light in a way that fabric and thread simply did not. James had cataloged enough photographs to know the difference between the way yarn reflected light and the way human hair did. This was hair, real hair, and it had been placed on a figure made to look like a young boy. He sat back. His coffee went cold beside him without his noticing. The combination of details was striking. Not just the human hair, but the specificity of the boy doll's clothing, the formality of his posture, the deliberate placement in his own chair at the edge of the family portrait. This was not decoration. This was not a child's toy left carelessly in the background of a photograph. The figure had been dressed to match the occasion. It had been given its own seat. It had been positioned to be seen. James pulled out his notebook and wrote 2 questions at the top of a clean page. First, whose hair is this? Second, why is this boy doll in a family portrait? He did not know yet that answering those 2 questions would take him the better part of a year. He did not know that the answer would be both simpler and more devastating than anything he imagined. He only knew, with the particular instinct that years of archival work had given him, that this photograph was asking him something. And he intended to find out what. James did not act impulsively. That was not his nature. He spent the rest of that Tuesday finishing his cataloging work, but the image stayed with him, open in a separate tab, something he returned to between tasks, studying the boy doll from different angles, as if a new perspective might answer his questions before he had even begun to look. By Wednesday morning, he had made a decision. He reached out to a colleague at the university's forensic anthropology department, a woman named Dr. Patricia Owens, who had spent years working on the analysis of biological materials in historical contexts. He sent her a high-resolution crop of the doll's hair with a simple message. "I need your informal opinion on this. Is this what I think it is?" Her reply came 3 hours later, 4 words. Yes, without any doubt. They met for coffee that afternoon. Patricia brought a printed enlargement of the image and set it on the table between them without ceremony. "The curl pattern, the density, the way it catches light," she said, pointing with her pen. "This is human hair. African-American hair, almost certainly, given the texture. Whoever made this figure used real hair, and they used quite a lot of it. Enough to give a full head of hair to a boy doll." "Could it have come from a living person?" James asked. "A haircut, something like that?" Patricia considered this carefully. "Possible, in theory. But look at the quantity and the intention. This isn't a casual detail. This hair was applied to give this figure the appearance of a specific child. The clothing is specific, too. The white shirt, the suspenders, the dark trousers. This is a portrait of someone, a boy, someone the family knew." The word landed quietly between them. "Victorian mourning hair," James said. "Exactly. Practiced across many communities well into the early 20th century, particularly in communities where there were few resources, few formal ways to mark loss. You kept what you could keep. You made what you needed to make." She paused. "But I've never seen it done quite like this. Not incorporated into a figure dressed as a specific child, placed in a family portrait. Whoever made this wanted that boy to be in the photograph." James looked at the image again, the 5 living faces, and beside them, in his own chair, a small figure dressed in Sunday clothes with real hair on his head. There was a 6th member of this family. The photograph had no names. That was the first obstacle. And in the context of black American families in 1910, it was not a small one. The systematic exclusion of black families from public records, census documentation, and institutional archives meant that tracing a family from a single undated image was significantly more complicated than it would have been for a white family of the same era. James began where he always began, with what the image itself could tell him. The family was in Georgia, or at least the photograph had come from a Georgia historical society. The room suggested a rural or small-town setting, not an urban one. The quality of the clothing indicated a family with some economic stability, not wealth, but sufficiency. The man in the photograph looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s. The woman, perhaps a few years younger. 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, ranging in age from roughly 6 to 12. James cross-referenced the donation records from the Historical Society. The photograph had been part of a larger collection donated in 2008 by the estate of an elderly woman in Meriwether County, Georgia, who had died without direct heirs. The collection had been boxed and mostly uncatalogued. The photograph had sat in storage for 13 years before being digitized. He contacted the Historical Society directly and spoke with a volunteer named Dorothy, who had been involved in the original cataloging. Dorothy remembered the collection vaguely. Boxes of paper, photographs, household documents. Nothing that had seemed remarkable at the time. "Was there anything with names?" James asked. Dorothy paused. "There was a Bible," she said slowly. "I think it went to the county library. Old family Bibles sometimes have records written inside. Births, marriages, deaths. It's worth checking." James drove to Meriwether County on a Friday. The library was small, the kind of building that smelled of old wood and dust in the best possible way. The librarian, a young man named Calvin, found the Bible within 20 minutes, a worn King James edition with a cracked spine and a front page covered in handwriting. James stood at the reference desk and read the names written in faded ink: births, marriages, 1 death. His finger stopped on a single line near the bottom of the page, written in a different hand, slightly shakier, as if written under some weight. Samuel, born March 3rd, 1903. Departed February 14th, 1910, 7 years old. And the photograph was dated 1910. James closed the Bible carefully and stood very still for a moment. The boy doll in the photograph wore a white shirt and dark suspenders, the clothes a 7-year-old boy would have worn to church. There was a 6th member of this family, and his name was Samuel. Samuel. The name settled into James's research like a stone into still water, sending quiet ripples outward in every direction. He sat in the Meriwether County Library for 2 more hours, carefully photographing every page of the Bible. Alongside the birth and death records, there were small marginal notes. Verses underlined, a pressed flower between 2 pages, a child's pencil drawing tucked into the back cover. The drawing was simple: a house, a tree, a figure with round eyes and outstretched arms. The handwriting of a young child, made with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who had no idea the drawing would outlast him by more than a century. James photographed it last, before closing the Bible. The death record for Samuel listed no cause. That was not unusual for the time, particularly in rural black communities, where death certificates, when they existed at all, were often incomplete. James would need to look elsewhere. He drove back to Nashville with the photographs on his phone and a list of next steps forming in his mind. Over the following 2 weeks, he worked through the available records methodically. Georgia death records from 1910, county health reports, church registries from the area. It was painstaking work, full of gaps, but gradually a picture began to emerge. There had been a tuberculosis outbreak in Meriwether County in the winter of 1909 to 1910. It had moved through several rural communities with particular severity, affecting families who had limited access to medical care. Children under 10 had been especially vulnerable. Samuel would have been 6 years old that winter. James found a single entry in a Baptist church registry, a record of a funeral service held on February 17, 1910, 3 days after the date listed in the Bible. The entry named the deceased as Samuel, son of Thomas and Ada. No age, no further details. Just the date and the name and the words, "Return to the Lord." James printed the entry and pinned it to the board above his desk, next to the photograph. He stood back and looked at both of them together, the family in their Sunday best, the small boy doll in his own chair, dressed in a white shirt and dark trousers with real hair on his head. Ada had saved her son's hair. She had sewn it onto a figure dressed to look like him, dressed as he would have been dressed for church, for a portrait, for any occasion important enough to mark with care. And she had placed him in his own chair, so that when the family gathered to be seen, he was seen too. James sat down slowly. Something very quiet had just become very clear. Before going any further, James knew he needed to understand the tradition fully, not just as a footnote, but as the cultural and emotional context without which the boy doll could not be properly understood. He spent a week in research. What he found was both more widespread and more complex than he had initially known. The practice of preserving human hair as a memorial object had deep roots in European and American culture. Throughout the Victorian era, roughly 1837 to 1901, mourning hair art had been a respected and common form of grief expression. Families kept locks of hair from deceased loved ones in lockets, shadow boxes, and framed arrangements. Skilled artisans created intricate wreaths and pictures woven entirely from hair. It was intimate, tactile, and deeply personal, a way of keeping something biological, something irreducibly of the person, after the person was gone. The practice crossed racial and economic lines. In black communities across the South, where systemic exclusion from formal institutions meant that grief had fewer official channels, the preservation of physical memory took on additional weight. There were no elaborate headstones for many. Church records were incomplete. Photographs were rare and expensive. What families kept, they kept carefully. The incorporation of hair into a handmade figure, particularly a figure made to resemble a deceased child dressed in the clothes he would have worn in life, had precedents that James found documented in several historical studies of African American mourning practices in the post-Reconstruction South. It was not common, but it was not without precedent. It was a way of making grief visible within the domestic space, of insisting on the reality of a small life in a world that was structured to minimize it. What made Samuel's case particularly striking was the specificity of the figure. This was not simply a lock of hair preserved in a locket or pressed under glass. Ada had constructed a boy. She had dressed him as Samuel would have been dressed. She had given him Samuel's hair. And then she had seated him at the edge of her family's portrait as if to say, "Count him. He is still one of us." James read a passage from a 1994 academic study that stopped him cold. A researcher had interviewed elderly black women in Georgia and Alabama about family objects and heirlooms. One woman, then in her 90s, had described watching her grandmother make a figure after the death of a child. She said the child needed to still be in the house, the woman had recalled. She said a mother doesn't stop being a mother just because the child is gone. James read the sentence twice. Then he looked at the photograph, at Ada's expression, that thing between sadness and dignity, and he understood exactly what he was looking at. James had names now, Thomas and Ada, a son named Samuel, a death in the winter of 1910, and a portrait taken in the months that followed. But he wanted to understand more about Ada, about the specific decision she had made and what it had cost her to make it. He returned to the church registry in Meriwether County and spent an afternoon going through records from that congregation between 1905 and 1920. He found Thomas and Ada listed as members. He found baptism records for their children. And then, in the meeting, minutes from a church gathering in April 1910, 2 months after Samuel's death. He found something unexpected. The minutes recorded a discussion among church members about supporting families affected by the tuberculosis outbreak. Several families were named. Thomas and Ada's family was among them. The record noted that Ada had been ill herself during the winter, but had recovered. It also noted, briefly, that the family had requested a formal portrait be taken, a practice that the church sometimes facilitated for its members as a way of marking significant life events. A portrait taken in the aftermath of illness and loss. A mother who had nearly died herself, who had survived when her son had not, who had then dressed her remaining children in their finest clothes, stood beside her husband in their best room, and asked that a small figure, a boy doll made with her dead son's hair, dressed in the clothes of a living child, be placed in the chair beside them before the shutter was pressed. James thought about what that decision had required. Not just the grief, which was its own enormous thing, but the practical courage of it. To insist that the portrait include Samuel in the only way available. To have sewn that figure with her own hands, cutting the fabric, shaping the body, carefully attaching the hair she had saved from her son's head, and while still recovering from her own illness. And then to have dressed him. To have chosen the white shirt and the dark trousers and the small suspenders. The same clothes Samuel would have worn had he been alive to stand in that room with his family. There was also something else James had been turning over since early in his research. The photograph had survived. It had traveled from a family's hands through a century of change, through the deaths of everyone who had known what the boy doll meant, and it had arrived eventually in a digital archive in Nashville, still holding its secret intact. Ada had made something that lasted. She had not known it would. She had only known that she needed to make it. By the spring of 2022, James had a story. What he did not yet have was a living connection to it. Someone for whom this discovery would be not just historically significant, but personally real. He knew the family's first names, he knew the county, he knew the church, and he knew that 3 children had survived. The 2 girls and the boy, visible in the photograph. If any of them had had children of their own, there was a possibility, however uncertain, that descendants still existed. He began the search carefully, aware that it could lead nowhere. Many black families from rural Georgia in the early 20th century had dispersed during the Great Migration, moving north and west in search of work and safety. Records were fragmented. Family connections had often been severed by distance and time. He posted a query in a genealogical research group that focused on African American family histories in the Deep South. He contacted 2 genealogists who specialized in post-Reconstruction Georgia records. He wrote to 3 historically black churches in Meriwether County, explaining what he was looking for. 6 weeks passed. Then, in early May, he received an email. The sender's name was Diane. She was 67 years old and lived in Atlanta. She had seen his query through a cousin involved in genealogical research. Her great-grandmother, she wrote, had grown up in Meriwether County, Georgia. Her great-grandmother's name had been Ruth. And Ruth, according to the family's oral history, had had a brother who died very young, a brother whose name had passed out of living memory somewhere in the decades between. James read the email 3 times before he replied. He asked carefully, not wanting to lead her, "Did your family's oral history ever mention a photograph?" Diane's response came the next morning. She had called her mother, 91 years old, still sharp, and asked about old family photographs. Her mother had paused for a long time. Then she had said, "There was one. A portrait. Mama Ruth said it was special, that there was something in it that the family knew about but didn't talk about. She said her mother had put love into that picture in a way nobody outside the family would understand." James sat with that sentence for a long time. Love into that picture in a way nobody outside the family would understand. He picked up the phone and called Diane. James arranged to meet Diane in Atlanta on a Saturday in June. He brought a printed copy of the photograph, large format, high resolution, rolled carefully in a cardboard tube. He also brought all of his documentation, the Bible records, the church registry entries, the research on morning hair practices, the tuberculosis outbreak records. He wanted her to be able to see everything, to understand not just the conclusion, but the path that had led there. They met at Diane's home in a quiet neighborhood in southwest Atlanta. She had invited her mother, Loretta, who sat in a high-backed chair in the living room with the alertness of someone accustomed to paying close attention to the world. James unrolled the photograph on the coffee table. Diane leaned forward immediately. Loretta went very still. "That's them," Loretta said. Her voice was quiet and certain. "That's the family." James walked them through everything he had found. He explained the Bible entry, Samuel, born 1903, departed February 1910. He explained the tuberculosis outbreak. He explained the church records, the portrait request, made in grief's aftermath. And then, gently, he explained the boy doll. He showed them the enlarged crop. He pointed to the white shirt, the dark trousers, the small suspenders. He explained what Patricia had confirmed, that the hair was human, real, preserved with care, and applied to give the figure the appearance of a specific child. He explained the mourning hair tradition, the historical precedent, the specific and deliberate nature of what Ada had made. He told them what he believed Ada had done and why. The room was very quiet when he finished. Diane had her hand over her mouth. Loretta was looking at the photograph, at the small figure in the wooden chair, dressed in his Sunday clothes, with an expression James recognized, that thing between grief and dignity. Samuel, Loretta said, almost to herself. That was his name. I never knew his name. Your great-grandmother Ruth was in this photograph, James said. She was one of the girls standing beside her mother. She grew up knowing that portrait was special, knowing her mother had dressed a figure to look like her brother and placed him there so he would be counted among them. That knowledge traveled with her through her whole life, even after the specific details were lost. Loretta reached out and touched the edge of the photograph with one finger, resting it lightly on the small figure in the chair. She dressed him for the portrait, she said quietly, same as the others. She wasn't going to leave him out. It was not a question. It was a recognition, the kind that crosses time without effort. In the weeks after his meeting with Diane and Loretta, James completed his formal documentation of the case. He wrote a detailed account of the discovery and submitted it to the university archive, where the photograph was reclassified with its full context. The family name, the names of the individuals pictured, the story of Samuel, and a thorough explanation of the boy doll and the mourning hair tradition that had produced him. He also submitted a shorter version to a journal of African American history, where it was accepted for publication and appeared in the autumn issue of 2022. The response to the article was significant. Historians and cultural researchers wrote to James from across the country, several noting that the case was one of the most fully documented examples of mourning hair practice in an African American domestic context from that period, and arguably the most emotionally complete, given the specificity of the figure Ada had made. Others wrote about the weight of it, a mother who had nearly died herself, who had survived to sew her grief into the shape of her son and seat him among the living. But the response that stayed with James longest came not from a historian. It came from Diane, 2 weeks after the article was published. She wrote to tell him that her mother Loretta had read the article in full, slowly, with her reading glasses and a cup of tea. When she finished, Loretta had set the article down and sat quietly for a while. Then she had said, I want you to thank that man. Tell him that Samuel has a name again. James read that sentence at his desk on an October afternoon, the same month, almost exactly a year later, when he had first opened the archive file and noticed something unusual in a small wooden chair at the edge of the frame. He thought about Ada. About the winter of 1910, the illness, the loss, the portrait arranged with such deliberate care. About the choice she had made, to cut the fabric, to stitch the body, to carefully press Samuel's hair into place and dress him in his Sunday best, to carry him to the chair herself and position him so that he faced the camera the same way his brothers and sisters did, to insist, in the only way available to her, that her family was not 5 but 6. She could not have known that a historian would find the photograph. She could not have known that the hair she had saved would survive a century and carry her son's story forward into a world she never lived to see. She had only done what she needed to do. What any mother, in any time, might have done when the world gave her no other way to say, he was here, he was mine, he mattered. The photograph had always held that truth. It had simply been waiting for someone to look closely enough to find it. Some images are not records of the past. They are letters to the future, written in love, sealed in grief, and addressed to anyone patient enough to read them.